we're coping pretty well with that. I have a couple of announcements that the next and final in this part of the FrackingSENSE series, the next one, Dr. Goldstein, who is speaking on public health impacts, we've had to change that from Tuesday to Wednesday. So that is more disorienting than the absence of snowfall for us. So that will be a week from tomorrow night, 6:30 in here. But because the universe is defiant of me and my preferences, and gremlins get to work on people's schedules, while we will be here at 6:30 on Wednesday, a week from Wednesday with Dr. Goldstein, Josh Fox, who made Gasland, will be at the UMC Ballroom at 6:30. The gremlins enjoy that very much. This is the moment a gremlin lives, well, they live, I'm not even sure if they're alive, but those creatures that get into the scheduling systems, they are having a triumph here. So, and there's just something, I think I can live with that. If I were a character in a novel and the novelist had us having a credentialed public health expert speaking at the same time as a fine sort of polemical filmmaker in some ways, and anyway, that would be something that the novelist would probably have happen to me, that we would just have those two things come together. So you will be making your choices about which group you join. I should say, I'm always forgetting to do this, that I'm always forgetting to thank our co-sponsors, which are Boulder County and the County Commissioners, so I appreciate their participation. We are going to be starting up again in the fall, and I will be inviting people who have taken stronger positions and who are still working from an evidence-based point. And as several of you have said, it will be very stimulating and interesting to have the same peppering of questions that this group produces for people in that situation. I am receptive to one-on-one conversations about my management of the governor's visit. I've already had a number of stimulating conversations with people who probably wouldn't have joined a fan club for me, but that's okay, because there is no fan club for me, so there's no place to go or join it, so they're not in any very sad situation from that. But I have learned a lot about, well, really through this whole experience, the whole word neutrality has become much richer and more complex for me, and those people are helping me get further into depth on that. So if you would like to have one of those conversations, do contact me about that. We'll follow our usual drill here, that you have little note cards there, little sheets, and there are pencils, and we can get you more of those. So if you will start filling those out when you have questions, in about half an hour or so, folks from the center will come around and pick those up and give them to me. Okay, those are the announcements. Oh, it's just good news that the Center of the American West in the summer will put up our first report on our NSF project, what we know, what we don't know, and what we hope to learn. So sometime in the summer you'll have that to look at. Okay, so tonight we're very fortunate to have Dan Grossman, who is the Regional Director of the Rocky Mountain Office of the Environmental Defense Fund. He was before he joined that organization in May of 2006, and years before that he spent 10 years in the Colorado General Assembly, which was a very festive and merry experience. It gave him many an anecdote and profound glimpses of human nature, as I think, and shallow versions of human nature from time to time too. But just a wonderful background for somebody now working in public policy to have been in that public servant role, elected official. Dan leads at EDF. He leads the organization's efforts to protect land, water, and wildlife in the interior West. His work focuses on agricultural policy, water rights, endangered species, and habitat conservation. And EDF, as many of you know, has been very attentive to climate change issues and really working every waking minute and probably into the dream cycle on how to get climate issues and energy production into a better match. So it is my privilege to introduce Dan Grossman.
Thank you, and thank you, Patty, and thank you to the Center of the American West. I love the name. This is the center of the American West. It's kind of daunting to be here, but it's an honor to present today. I want to start off with a little bit of background about me and EDF and how we come at the issue of natural gas, just as a matter of kind of informing the conversation as we go forward. the series has me billed as the environmental perspective on natural gas. And while I think that's great and an apt description, the environmental community, as most of you in this room definitely know, is not a monolith. We have a bunch of different perspectives on every issue that can come up, and EDF is no different. We have certainly a lot of views about the best ways to address environmental problems, and most of those solutions tend to be market-driven. Patty mentioned that EDF has been focused on climate change for many, many years, and that's true. And we put, for better or for worse, we put all of our eggs in the cap and trade basket. We spent many years lobbying in Congress, organizing businesses to come with us to Congress to get a cap on carbon emissions in the trading system, to reduce carbon emissions and to address global warming that way. We thought we were there. We were that close. We got a bill through the House of Representatives, which was no small task. Unfortunately, we never got a vote on the merits in the Senate, and now we've been pivoting. How else, if national climate legislation and a global treaty on global warming as a successor to Kyoto is not going to be the method, at least in the foreseeable future, what else can we do to address climate change? And we've done lots of different things in this arena, and it's really how we ended up, from a national perspective, engaging on the issue of natural gas. And that's really going to be the theme of my presentation today, is that it's not as simple as natural gas boom is a problem or the natural gas boom is an opportunity. It's both. And it's really important that all of us kind of take a look at the entire picture when it comes to the gas boom and the development issues that come along with it, and that we don't kind of just focus on our particular issues with it. Now, one more caveat. That's really easy for an organization the size of EDF to say, or for me to say, working in this beautiful town of Boulder, going home to my house in Stapleton in Denver, and not having to have a drill rig down the street. So understanding that, those are different perspectives that people bring to this issue. Additionally, I don't have any relatives who rely on the oil and gas industry for their incomes and for their sustenance. So again, that's a different perspective that I don't bring to the table. So in addition to all these different perspectives from the environmental community, I think it's important for all of us to understand that there are lots of different perspectives to come at this issue, and you've heard from many of them in this speaker series. So with all of those caveats and misgivings, I'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. So it's an opportunity and a risk, and some of your other speakers have probably talked about some of these opportunities that the shale gas boom brings to this country. And I think it's important also, you've probably already heard this, but it bears repeating, I think, is that when people are talking about fracking and hydraulic fracturing, a lot of times people are just talking about oil and gas activity in general, fracking being shorthand for oil and gas development. From a technical perspective, that's not accurate. I don't think it's necessarily important for the purposes of our discussion today, but hydraulic fracturing is one discrete activity that happens way underground when lots of pressure is put on geographic formations to get gas up and out of the ground. It's something that's been around for a really long time. The reason why it's important, and I think the reason why Patty and your center has put this together, is because it has created this economic bonanza, if you will. And it's not just natural gas, but it's oil as well, that is being accessible now because of these technological advancements, hydraulic fracturing, directional drilling. So just so that we're getting our terminology right, and that took me the better part of 3 months to figure all that out, but I finally did. But it's important to know that these technological advancements have brought promise in an economic sector in a way that we haven't seen in a very, very long time in this country. So I think the big caveat is there are great opportunities, but it has to be done the right way. And if we don't do it the right way, then we lose those opportunities, and those opportunities become challenges and problems that could get very difficult to try to address. So again, I talked about the economic development issue that comes with oil and gas activity. You hear this over and over again from industry, but also from folks in the political world who are very eager to point out the economic benefits to Colorado and to the nation of a robust oil and gas industry. And I think it's beyond dispute that sector is a contributor to our economic well-being in this state. Pretty difficult to argue otherwise. I will say that, we've had a lot of booms and busts in this state. For those of us who have been around for a while, and I have, we've seen a lot of those booms and busts. We've seen a lot of towns spring up and then go away. And so it's not like this economic development thing is something that is just going to be a given from here on out because we figured out hydraulic fracturing. Boom and bust cycles in the energy area are common, and I think we'll continue to see more in the future. On that front, I do a little bit of work in North Dakota, and it is amazing. The Bakken Formation is a huge oil play. It covers about the western 2/3 of the state of North Dakota. And the economic bonanza that has happened in that part of the state is really unbelievable. You literally have towns springing up out of the plains, man camps dotting the landscape, huge problems with infrastructure with regards to roads and schools and hospitals, just really an inability of government to provide basic services when towns that didn't exist a year ago now have 35,000 people living there. It's pretty amazing. And I'll just say, as an aside, you can see the Bakken from space. You've probably seen it National Geographic because of the flaring that they do in North Dakota. And it's just a funny anecdote that me and my East Coast liberal elite buddies like to snigger. You can see the Bakken from space. It's terrible. You go to North Dakota, it's like, yeah, you can see the Bakken from space. That's awesome. Again, perspective. It's all about perspective. So what are some of the other issues that the shale gas boom and the shale oil boom bring? And that's increased energy security. The United States, if those of you who pay attention, has long been, until recently, an energy importer. We've been largely dependent on nations who don't have such good intentions towards the United States for oil in particular. But shale oil and shale gas have the potential of making the United States an energy exporter, or at least self-sufficient in energy. And that's important for a whole lot of reasons, for economic reasons, for foreign policy reasons. It's just generally, I think, understood that that would be a positive. The gas boom, not talking about oil now, but the gas boom really has the potential of creating less air pollution from the fuel that we burn. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a bit. But if you just look at the combustion of fuels, and you look at coal versus natural gas, then the advantage is pretty clear. It's a little bit less so when you take into account the entire life cycle of the fuel from extraction, transportation, production, or combustion, all of those things into account. It's a little less clear that that's the case, but we still see a lot of potential for there being a lot less air pollution. And we'll talk about the different types of air pollution, the climate forcing air pollution versus the hazardous air pollution, and why and ozone, and why those distinctions are important in a little bit. But it's important to understand that there is the potential there for less air pollution, and there's the potential for fewer greenhouse gas from combustion, especially if you're talking vis-a-vis coal. A few years ago, EDF and some other organizations worked with utilities in the state and natural gas operators to pass legislation to get Xcel Energy to move away from their oldest coal units and fire their plants with natural gas. It was called the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act. It was remarkable, the partnerships that were involved in getting that through the legislature, and the result is about 950 megawatts of coal are being taken offline and replaced with natural gas. It would be great if it were being replaced by renewable energy. And I think that is an important debate that we should have. Is are we making natural gas a replacement for coal, or are we making it a bridge fuel to a renewable future? And I think that's a legitimate question. I'm not sure any of us in the policy realm have exactly figured out the answer to that, but it's something that we really need to keep our eyes on. EDF does not support natural gas as just a permanent replacement for coal. We do support it as a transition or a bridge fuel to a cleaner energy future. So those are the things that, if done the right way, the gas boom can have definite benefits. But let's be clear-eyed about this. Friday Night Lights, you guys like Friday Night Lights? I love that show that was on. The football show, the coach, clear eyes, full heart, can't lose, right? So this is the clear eyes thing. We need to be clear-eyed about the risk that not just the combustion of natural gas as a fuel pose, but the whole entire life cycle of the extraction, the transportation, and the combustion of the fuel means. So let's talk about some of those potential risks. It's an industrial process. I'm sure you've heard this over and over again, but natural gas extraction, like coal mining, like oil extraction, like anything, it's an industrial process, and it's not the cleanest thing in the world. You can be a grade A company that spends tons of money on environmental restoration and making sure that everything is as clean as it possibly can be, and it's still going to be an industrial process that involves things that are dirty and ugly and things that we don't like. One of the things that we've learned with increased activity, and again, it has very little to do with hydraulic fracturing, it just has to do with the activity involved in oil and gas drilling, is contamination of groundwater and surface water from spills. There are very few instances. Some people would prominently say in industry-supported ads, zero. I wouldn't go that far. Instances of contamination of groundwater aquifers from the actual downhole process of fracking. But there are lots and lots and lots of examples, some of them have been in the newspaper recently, of contamination of aquifers and surface water streams from spills that happen on the surface with the activity around fracking, oil and gas activity. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. But there is that risk, and it's something that that we need to be cognizant of, and it needs to be part of the public discussion. Now, the state has adopted a groundwater monitoring, baseline and monitoring rule. EDF participated in that rulemaking. It didn't really go the way we wanted, but it was an effort to address the risk posed by oil and gas development in the state. And so we do have both a statewide rule and a different rule that applies in what's called the Greater Wattenberg area. But the idea was to address the risk that goes along with oil and gas activity to our groundwater and even our surface water resources. One other thing that gets overlooked a lot, but something that we should talk about, is that fracking, now I am talking about fracking, takes a lot of water. Now it's less than 1%, and the governor's very fond of saying it's less than 1% of the state's water is used for fracking. But that 1% or less than 1% could be pretty important as we go into drought cycles. Fortunately, we've had a lot of moisture recently, but we're still in the throes of what's now a 13-year drought in the Colorado River Basin. If we're going to be utilizing a lot of water for energy, then we need to figure out where that's going to come from. Is it going to come from agriculture? Is it going to come from municipal and industrial use? Is it going to come from the environment? These are all important. These are all very important questions that we need to think about when we're talking about the risks from increased oil and gas activity in the state. As I said a moment ago, there are air emissions that can threaten public health. It's not just methane, which we'll talk a lot about, but it's also ozone. A lot of the emissions that come from oil and gas activity contain volatile organic compounds, which are precursors to ozone. Ozone's bad for you, I hear. I'm not a scientist, but I don't mean to make light of it, but the state has serious ozone problems, and oil and gas activity, which I'll get into a little bit more later on, is a contributor to those ozone problems, and so we need to be cognizant of that as one of the potential risks. And then, as I said a moment ago, there is the risk that increased oil and gas, or using more natural gas as a fuel, and leaky oil and gas activities, development activities, have the potential of exacerbating global warming by producing more greenhouse gas than we're currently emitting. One of the, those of you who read the newspaper have seen that in the period of the last decade, Colorado's CO2 emissions have actually gone up when a lot of the rest of the country and the rest of the world have been seeing their emissions go down. That's kind of startling, and it's something for us to think pretty hard about as to why. But one of the main reasons that we could possibly see increased greenhouse gas emissions from increased oil and gas activity is because of methane. Methane is a powerful climate-forcing gas that is much more potent than carbon dioxide. So if you burn it, that's one thing, and you are creating carbon dioxide when you burn it. But when you're venting it to the atmosphere, or it's leaking from oil and gas rigs or whatever, if it's getting into the atmosphere, it's much, much more potent in its climate-forcing properties than carbon dioxide. And so that's something that we need to be mindful of. So that's one of the other potential risks. And then, of course, you have the things that fortunately in my everyday life I don't have to deal with, but many people in this state have to deal with every day, and that's the cumulative impacts of increased activity. One of the things that we're seeing, and you've read about in the newspaper a lot, is that this activity is encroaching more and more on residential areas. That's a factor of where the gas is, and it's also a factor of increasing population and development throughout the state. And so we're seeing more conflicts, such as what we've been seeing in Longmont and elsewhere, of communities and the impacts that increased oil and gas activity have on those communities. And that's something that we need to be cognizant of as a true risk, not something just to be dismissed. One other issue that I think is important, and I think that is low-hanging fruit that really needs to be grabbed, is that when you erode the public's trust in whatever it is that you're doing, here we're talking about oil and gas activity, then it's going to make it much more difficult to do it in a way that's beneficial to everybody. We've seen the polarization of this issue get to such a height that, you know, Governor Hickenlooper can't go anywhere without being attacked for being a shill of industry, right? Rightly or wrongly. I won't offer an opinion about that, but this issue has become so polarized that people who deal with these impacts every day, or people who would just have to make decisions in the ballot box about their kids' future, are having to pick sides. And that's not a constructive place to be if we're really going to move forward. And I'd say that's true for any issue, but I think this is one in particular. And so I think industry has to do a better job of embracing progress. I think we all have to do a better job of understanding the economic implications of the policy decisions that we make. And I think we need to just turn down the volume of the conversation a little bit and start to build up that public trust that the industry isn't just out to make a profit, that they care about the planet too. That fractivists, so-called fractivists, I love labeling people, fractivists aren't out just because they're NIMBYists, but because they care about the future of the planet. Turning down the volume of the conversation and actually having a reasonable discussion, I think, is the way to go. But we just can't lose sight of the fact that if the public doesn't have trust in the way this resource is developed, that's going to be a long-term problem for industry. That's just me opining there. So let's talk about some of the impacts. Since I'm the environmentalist speaking, let's talk about some of the impacts. And I'm going to focus on air. We talked a little bit about water and the contaminants that can come from oil and gas activity to water. But let's talk a little bit about air. And we've already spoken a little bit about ozone. It's a harmful pollutant that when I was a kid growing up, the ozone alerts were because of car exhaust. And that's still a problem. But cars have gotten a lot cleaner. Catalytic converters have become ubiquitous. So cars are still a problem, but not as much a problem as they used to be. But we still have these days where people are told not to go outside if you have asthma, or if you're older, or if you're a kid, or if you exercise. So just about everybody in Boulder, right? So it really does impinge on our lifestyle, and it has serious health risks that go along with it. You're going to hear me talk about some counties in Colorado a little more often than others, but Weld and Larimer and Boulder County comprise the majority of what's called the Greater Wattenberg area. There are a few reasons I'm going to focus on this. Weld County alone has about 60%, or sorry, has about 40% of the 50,000 oil and gas wells in the state, and that's Weld County alone. That's part of the Greater Wattenberg area. In addition, they have about 60% of the new permits that are being awarded for drilling by the Oil and Gas Commission are in Weld County in the Greater Wattenberg area. So we're really seeing a focus where there's significant activity in the western slope in the Piceance Basin, the Denver-Julesburg, which is the big basin that is kind of eastern northeast Colorado, and then the Greater Wattenberg area, which is the Front Range, Boulder, Weld, Larimer County. These are areas that are being most significantly impacted by oil and gas activity right now. A lot of you live in this area, but nearly 24% of the population in Weld and Larimer are particularly vulnerable to ozone pollution, either because of their age or because they have asthma or they have some other lung condition or they're young. And that's pretty significant. When we talk about protective legislation, or we were down at the Oil and Gas Commission seeking rules that are protective of public health, or the Air Quality Control Commission, these are the types of people who we're most concerned about because they're directly impacted by ozone. And as I said, when I was a kid, most of that was because of tailpipe emissions from cars, but that's starting to change. It already has started to change. As many of you know, there's an ozone non-attainment area along the Front Range that includes this same general area, geographic area, where there's a lot of oil and gas activity. But it goes well beyond. It includes Rocky Mountain National Park, one of our crown jewels. And it's something that we need to be pretty cognizant of. One of the things that is particularly alarming is that we're seeing increased ozone alerts in rural areas where you don't have a lot of truck traffic or cars, but you do have a lot of oil and gas activity. So understanding that correlation is not causation, it's interesting nonetheless, and something for us to think about as we're thinking about the impacts. So let's get to causation then for a moment here, because there are a lot of people who say, well, no, oil and gas emissions don't have anything to do with ozone. That's separate, and you're getting things mixed up, and you're just not very smart, which is true. But we're seeing more and more evidence of causation rather than just correlation. I love this story because it kind of happened by accident. You have this cooperative institute for the Research of Environmental Sciences. It's a cooperative venture by NOAA and the University of Colorado. And you have these really smart graduate students and faculty members who just kind of think about and do interesting experiments around lots of issues, but with focus on air quality. Well, they have an air quality monitor in a tower near Erie, or in Erie, somewhere around Erie. And some of the grad students went out there to flip it on one night because they just were curious as to what nighttime, I think it was nighttime ozone emissions were, basically what the constituents of the air was. And the readings were through the roof. I don't really know what that means, but they were really high. And so they were kind of surprised by how high these readings were. So, and in the study, one of the things that they found is that they were seeing huge amounts of constituents of VOCs that are potentially ozone building blocks. So they wanted to figure out where it was coming from. And so they did the chemical analysis, and what they found is that 55% of these chemicals that they were detecting, these VOCs, bore the signature of the chemicals that come from oil and gas, or from natural gas, from methane. And so they broke it down further, and they said, what does this mean? Well, one of the things that they found is that the propane levels in the air in Erie were 10 times higher than Pasadena, California, 4 times higher than Houston, Texas. And this set off a bunch of alarms, again, because we've seen so much more activity in this area in Weld County and in eastern Boulder County, and we're seeing more of it in eastern Boulder County and in Larimer County. That it's pretty strong evidence that there is causation here between the oil and gas activity and the increase in VOCs and the building blocks of ozone. So that's something that we really need to dig a little bit more into and see what we can do to address it. There have been a lot more instances of violations in Weld County since they've seen increased oil and gas activity. And bordering on the non-attainment area that we talked about earlier. Rocky Mountain National Park has been registering non-attainment, which is pretty amazing, but it borders the same area as well. You may have seen in the newspaper just today that you can put it in the category of rural areas experiencing ozone problems where there are no cars, but now we're seeing the monitoring station in Rangeley, which is a western slope town in Rio Blanco County, registering exceedances of ozone. That was in the newspaper today. And the EPA has stated that it is most likely being caused by oil and gas activity in the Uinta Basin in Utah. So you have these areas where, again, you don't have a whole lot of other activity other than oil and gas activity where you're seeing these ozone problems. And as I said, Colorado's been struggling with ozone issues for years, and if we don't get a handle on emissions from oil and gas, we're going to continue to struggle with compliance with the Clean Air Act. So some of the other issues that go along with oil and gas that are more locally important for the folks who live right near oil and gas activity is emissions of toxic air pollutants like benzene. And there have been studies that are showing that unhealthy levels from emissions from oil and gas emit benzene into the air at dangerous levels. This NOAA study that I know has been somewhat disputed by industry, but it concludes that oil and gas activity is probably the leading source of benzene in Boulder County, and that the estimates are that it's many, many more times what all other sources of benzene could be in the state. So that's something that we should be cognizant of. I talked a little bit about methane already and how it is it's an important thing for lots of reasons. One is that that's what natural gas is, it's methane. And it's the product that oil and gas, or the natural gas companies sell for us to burn in our houses, for our factories to make things. It's a valuable resource for lots and lots of reasons. But it's also important because it's a very potent climate forcer. If you look at the 100-year time frame, and it's different based on what time frame you look at, but if you look at the 100-year time frame, it's 20 times more potent than CO2. So when you see calculations about CO2 equivalent or CO2e, this is what they're talking about. They're trying to compare it to what CO2 does in the atmosphere versus what methane does. And in a 100-year time frame, it's 20 times more powerful. So this informs what I'll get into in a minute, which is you have to look at the whole life cycle of the production and the use of natural gas when deciding if it makes sense from a climate perspective to pursue it as a bridge fuel. It's also a contributor to large-scale ozone formation, as we just talked about. Ozone is not good. One of the issues that we continue to struggle with, and frankly a lot of the gaps in our understanding of this important issue, is how much methane is leaking from oil and gas operations. And it's not something that we have a conclusive answer to. There have been lots of studies. EDF is participating in a big study. CSU is engaging in a significant study. There are lots of studies that have been looking at how much is leaking, these are big operations. They include wellheads, they include gathering lines, they include compressor stations, all of this equipment spread out sometimes over lots and lots of area, all of which have the propensity to leak. And so how much are they leaking? And the reason why that's important is exactly this calculus that I'll get into in a minute. If it leaks a lot, then it's actually, from a climate change perspective, worse than sticking with coal. If it leaks a little bit, it's better. And so that answer, which kind of seems a little bit mundane and silly to try to figure out, and really hard to try to figure out, is really all the marbles when it comes to deciding whether or not natural gas is really a good tool. So as I said, there have been a range of estimates anywhere from 2.3% to 7.7%. There was an outlier out there, I think from Cornell, that was 9%. If it's that high, and frankly EDF doesn't think it's that high, but if it's that high, then it's really a different conversation that we need to be having. And the EPA is not even sure exactly what that leak rate is. So I mentioned this a minute ago, but EDF is working with a lot of our friends in the environmental community. Don't like how much we work with industry, but this is one of the instances where we're working with industry. We're calling it a production study. Hopefully there will be several phases of this production study where we're working with industry to actually figure out, go into specific operations in specific fields, looking at every aspect of the oil and gas operation and try to figure out what leaks, what practices can be done to reduce the leakage, and how much can we really reduce the leakage? Because these are the questions that I think will be driving the policy. So we've had great participation by industry in this study, and we hope to have some answers. It's not going to have a number A lot of people are hoping it's going to have a number. It's not going to have a number. It's not going to answer that question definitively. But I think it will kind of give us a blueprint of where we can go to minimize the kind of leakage that threatens the viability of natural gas as a bridge fuel. So this is the good news, right? This is the easy math. I went to law school, so I can't even, tell you what the difference is here. But I can see coal from a CO2 perspective, right? From a CO2 perspective, coal is much dirtier and has the potential to force more climate change than natural gas. So if you just look at the snapshot of combustion, it's a no-brainer, folks. We all should be excited about natural gas. It's not that simple, unfortunately. I wish it were. So you have to look at the whole life cycle, and on the top of this little cute little thing that somebody produced for me, you see that you look at, for coal, it's pretty simple. You've got coal mining and processing, you've got the transportation, usually by train, and then you've got the combustion. So that's pretty simple to do the math, figure out what the global warming footprint of coal is. Gas is a little bit trickier. So you've got the production and the extraction, right? Then you've got to pipe it. It's really hard to truck natural gas, right? You've got to pipe it to a processing facility. You've got to transmit it and store it. You have to separate out liquids. You have to do a bunch of things to it before you actually combust it for fuel. But not only that, then you have local distribution for other uses, such as transportation and other things. Also, if you look at the coal life cycle, there's no leakage. Coal doesn't go up into the atmosphere, right? It probably off-gasses something, I don't know. All you scientists know that. But it's a solid, it's easy to transport, there isn't leakage. Every step of the way here, you can see just by looking at these pictures and all those pipes and stuff, that there's opportunity for leakage. And that is methane, not CO2, going up into the atmosphere. And so that's why you have to kind of take into account the whole life cycle to figure out if it makes sense to do this. So as I said earlier, overall leak estimates range between 1 and 7.9%. All indications from EDF's investigations are it's closer to the 1% side than it is the 7.9%, but we don't know where. We think that it's a worthwhile goal to get to 1%. And then we can act with certainty as far as what makes sense to transition from, whether it be coal, gasoline for cars, etc. But as I said earlier, it's based on a lot of assumptions and not a lot of data. The EPA estimates are about 2.5%, but in 2011 they came back and said actually 1.4%. But whether it's 1.4 or 2.5, it still doesn't make sense in a lot of areas from a climate change perspective to move to natural gas. And this is something that EDF has been working very hard on. As I said, one use of natural gas, a big one, is for power generation, but it can also be used to fuel cars. The governor of this fine state is very high on the potential of converting passenger vehicles to CNG, which I think is a nice idea, but we haven't seen anything that would bear that out from a scientific perspective as benefiting the climate. So that's something that we need to be, that we need more thought and effort to figure that question out. This is a fancy graph that if you can figure it out, bonus points. All you really need to know is the x-axis is the break-even rate, and you'll see that on the left-hand side of each of those is the percentage natural gas leakage and where that break-even point is for the different fuels that you're switching out. So for a coal-fired power plant, we've got some room. 3.2% leakage rate makes it climate beneficial to switch to natural gas. Gasoline for transportation, not so much room. Heavy-duty diesel, not any room at all. So this is something that we need to think about. If we're going to get to that 1%, and we have confidence that that leakage rate is down to 1%, then it makes sense to pursue some of these other strategies. But if we're talking about 3% or 4% or higher, then we've got a lot of work to do in the life cycle of natural gas to make sure that that is actually climate beneficial. So that's a kind of a lot of downers. So what are the opportunities? I think there are a lot of them. You've heard me talk about leaks and leakage a lot, and fortunately the stuff that's leaking is really valuable. Well, some of it's more valuable than other of it, but and natural gas prices are pretty low right now. But this is what gas companies sell. It's not like some byproduct that nobody has any use for. This is product. This is profit. So fixing leaks, making your operations more efficient, has the dual benefit of improving the environment and improving your bottom line. The question is, how significant are the investments? How costly are they? And where's that break-even point? Where's that profit point for industry to make this, to make the investments that you need to be able to get to the point where the leakage rate is below that 1%, is 1% or below. Along these lines, I thought it was important to remind everyone, some of you may have been here when Governor Hickenlooper came to address you all. He testified in front of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee back in February. Most people remember it because he regaled the senators about his drinking fracking fluid. That's what made all the headlines. But he said something else that was really, really important. And that is that his desire, his aspiration for industry and for the state of Colorado in particular is to get to a point where we have zero tolerance for fugitive emissions. Zero tolerance. That's a lofty goal, but it's something that we are hopeful that we can get to. And maybe it doesn't mean that there are no emissions coming from oil and gas facilities. Maybe that's unrealistic. But as an objective, as a goal, that's something that we should strive to see. And I think that's something that industry should strive to see, since this is the product that they're putting into the sales line. So zero tolerance for fugitive emissions. I mean, who could be against zero tolerance for fugitives, right? Any fugitives. Anyway, okay. So there are things that industry has been doing and frankly could be doing better that could get us to that point where it is zero tolerance for fugitive emissions, or get us at least down to that percentage rate where it makes sense to use it as a bridge fuel. You may have heard of the idea of green completions. So when a well is drilled and production is about to start, usually there's a lot of gas that gets vented into the atmosphere. And the federal government has, through the EPA, has required green completions on new gas wells. And green completions are basically reduced emissions completions that capture that gas as it comes up. It's putting an investment on the front end so that once the well is brought to production, you're actually capturing the gas instead of venting it to the atmosphere. In Colorado, this is a success story. The Oil and Gas Commission adopted a rule requiring green completions for new oil and gas wells in the state. It's something that not a lot of other states have done, frankly. And what we were seeing, we're working on an inventory of leaky stuff in the oil and gas production and life cycle. And what we've seen in Colorado is we've seen pretty dramatic reductions of emissions from completions. And it's because this rule is working. And frankly, we were skeptical. We thought that there are so many loopholes in the rule. We were just worried that it just wasn't going to show up as significant, and it actually has. So there's hope there. This is the fugitive emissions issue, and this is the sexy part of the speech: leak detection and repair. All of these are really sexy, but this one is the real sexy. So lots of companies have regimes as to how they detect when their equipment is leaking, and some of them have what's called directed inspection and maintenance, and some of them have something more robust like leak detection and repair. What we've seen is that a robust leak detection and repair regime, where you go out on a frequent basis and check your equipment for leaks, and there are lots of ways that you can check your equipment for leaks. The latest and greatest is infrared cameras that can detect leaks pretty easily. And then you go out there, depending on the significance of the leak, and you repair it as quickly as you can. Again, you're improving the amount of product in your sales line, and you're stopping the methane from being vented directly into the atmosphere. this is really, really boring, but it's really, really important. If you just leave it to companies to make the investments that they want to make, or that they've calculated make economic sense for them to do, as opposed to looking at the longer term investments in the integrity of their systems, then I think what you get is a mishmash and very little realized emissions reductions. The state needs to adopt a stronger LDAR program that's required of all producers, that requires at least quarterly inspections of their equipment and rapid response and repair of leaky equipment. Again, really, really boring, but really, really important. What we're seeing is that fugitive emissions from these types of leaks, and it can be in anything from the casing head to gathering lines to compressors to tanks, all of these things that are leaking, that's where the biggest bang for your buck could be if you're going to do anything to reduce emissions, is just do a robust leak detection and repair regime. Storage vessels, these are tanks that are used to store product when it comes out. Some of it needs to condense and the liquids need to be taken off. These are things that leak, and sometimes it's something as simple as an employee leaving a hatch open that results in significant emissions of methane to the atmosphere. Again, really, really boring, but really important. And then finally, I want to talk about, you heard me talk a little bit about North Dakota a minute ago, but venting and flaring. And venting and flaring is, so a lot of us think about, especially those of us who don't have a whole lot of experience in oil and gas issues like me, we say that's an oil well and that's a gas well. It's really, really not that simple, and you can talk to anybody in the industry and they'll tell you that. It's never that simple. Most oil wells bring up gas. That's just the way the hydrocarbons are stored together, and when you do fracking, you bring up both. What we saw in North Dakota and what we learned from North Dakota is that if you don't plan ahead and you don't have the capacity to handle that gas when you're drilling an oil well, you're in trouble. You can do two things. You can vent it, which would be bad, as we've talked about, or you can flare it, which is also bad. It's not quite as bad as venting, but it's still bad, and it's a significant source of carbon dioxide pollution. And so in North Dakota, which is very different from Colorado, but one of the things about North Dakota is that most of the activity is on private land in North Dakota. And most of the standard lease agreement for industry with the landowners, who are often the mineral rights owners in North Dakota, we have lots more split estate here in Colorado, but in North Dakota you generally have landowners who are also the mineral rights owners. Most of their leases and the general template lease is for 1 year. You've got 1 year to prove up your lease. So get in there, start pumping, we'll worry about the rest later. So the operators go in there and they don't worry about building gathering lines. They don't worry about anything other than getting in there and proving up their well in that first year. Well, the Bakken is a pretty rich oil formation, and the fracking is releasing a lot of oil and a lot of associated gas. And so what we've seen, the reason why you can see it from space, as I said earlier, is because they don't have a choice other than venting, which is prohibited under North Dakota law, but to flare it. And that flaring, again, while it's not as pernicious as venting it directly to the atmosphere, it still has a huge impact on global warming, and it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. Well, under North Dakota law, you can do that. You can flare your well for a year without paying royalties to the royalty owners, without paying production taxes. Bad policy. And then after a year, by the way, if you still can't connect to a gathering line, or you still can't use it for powering equipment on site, you can ask the Industrial Commission for an exception and continue to flare without paying royalties or production taxes. So we want to get that right here. And let me tell you why I think it's so critical that we get this regulatory thing right here in Colorado, because we're about to see a lot more oil production in the state along the lines of what's happening in the Bakken. There's a formation in the DJ Basin called the Niobrara, and it's an oil shale. And we have 3 companies that are about to pour billions of dollars in investment into the Niobrara, which is an oil play. And like western North Dakota, the Niobrara has a lot of rural areas with not a lot of infrastructure in place. So if we have the same dynamic of operators trying to get in there and just start producing without actually doing the planning on the front end to get the gathering infrastructure in place, we're going to have the same problem. And so we need to get in front of that, and we need to make sure that operators are required on the front end to figure out what they're going to do with the associated gas when they start striking a well. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in the exact same shoes as in North Dakota. And, you know, truth be told, North Dakota's taking steps to address this. They've created some tax incentives for operators to use the gas beneficially on site. But they've still got a lot of work to do, including addressing flaring for free for a year. By the way, if you do it for a year, about 65% of the gas is gone. So if you wait a year, it's all gone. Not all of it, but most of it's gone. So that's just out of the pocket of the royalty owners and up in smoke, literally. So that's venting and flaring. It's something that, that Colorado needs to address through regulations as well. So that's it for my exciting PowerPoint presentation. I will say that it's been fascinating over the last 2 years that I've started working on this issue for EDF. And I think that we've had a lot of success in talking with industry about a lot of these issues, especially around the studies that we've been doing. We've had some limited success in addressing some of the regulatory issues, such as frac fluid disclosure. That was a good success. We've had some less success on some of the other issues that we've engaged in. But I really do think that we could benefit from turning down the volume a little bit and having constructive conversations like this. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Okay. There is method here. I'm going to start off with relationships to renewable. I'm going to start by putting my glasses on. That is really going to be important. Okay, I'm going to begin on relationship with renewables. So, oh, that's not the right. Okay, here we are. Increased gas production yielding cheap gas is making renewable energy less competitive in the market. How can renewables be realistically made more competitive in the market given this situation?
So it's a great question, and I think it's more of a short-term issue than it is a long-term issue. The problem with renewables, as we all know, is that from an investment standpoint on the front end, it just is not yet inexpensive enough on its own to compete. I think overall, market forces will determine largely which resource we use. At EDF, you know, we kind of look at it from a technologically agnostic point of view, which is let's let the market determine, but let's try to internalize in the market the costs, the environmental costs of the different resources. So, which is why we were so interested in cap and trade, and why we think under that situation, if you actually get an economy-wide cap on carbon, renewables do much, much better. And that's something that EDF will still aspire to, as will lots of others in the environmental arena. That is putting a price tag on carbon in a way that makes all fuels, it makes all renewables more competitive with fossil fuels. But cheap gas is cheap. That's absolutely true. I don't know if that's going to be a forever thing or a next few years thing. One of the things that the technology of fracking has done is just unbelievably increase the amount of reserves that energy poor countries have at their disposal. And so it's really going to spark an energy revolution. I share your concern that it become a replacement for renewables rather than a bridge to them. But I think that the way that you get there is actually putting a price on carbon.
This is very similar, but gives you a little bit more chance to reflect here. Natural gas would only be a bridge fuel if if we were making massive investments in developing that to which we are bridging. In reality, natural gas is competing with renewables, so can you honestly say natural gas is a bridge fuel? So, but let's focus, since we're sort of repeating that question, but on what might be happening with investment in renewables and shifting of resources in that direction.
Yeah, and I think that as technology develops, and as we see renewable energy, the technology of renewable energy get to the point where it's more economical, I think that hopefully the market will correct itself. But I do think that the big issue out there is the big difference between these fuels is the environmental cost of each. You can get at that by continuing to subsidize through tax credits or other mechanisms, investments in renewable energy, or you can try to address it through market forces by creating a cost. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but I really do think in the long term, from a macro perspective, a price on carbon is the only thing that's going to make renewables competitive.
Have we really analyzed the comparative impacts of renewables, metal mining, new transmission lines, wildlife and birds? So how do we get renewables environmentally right?
I guess I file that under what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? You have to look at the whole life cycle of producing the fuel. And I think that's something that frankly, EDF hasn't spent a whole lot of time thinking about, which is what are the other environmental impacts of renewable energy. We have talked a little bit about impacts of energy development generically on the environment and how to mitigate that. Again, trying to use market forces to do so, creating habitat credit trading systems, for example, to mitigate the impacts of anything from solar farm or wind farm to oil and gas wells, to address the impacts on endangered species, or maybe not even endangered species, but species of interest throughout the country. These are market-based solutions that I think are much more durable. But I think the question really does drive home the point that when you're looking at a fuel source, you should, and the impacts it has to the environment, you should look at all of the impacts. I'll say that EDF tends to be somewhat obsessed with the impacts on climate change and less concerned about things like impacts to wildlife, although we have a land, water, wildlife program that's interested in that. But when we're looking kind of at the macro energy level, we're much more focused on climate change.
You had mentioned that other countries and the impact of the technology in other countries, but shifting to the export of U.S. produced energy. Given that natural gas abundance could provide energy independence and security for the U.S., how do we guard against profiteering from foreign exporting of liquid natural gas and subsequent higher demand and prices? And my own added question, I usually do not put things in here, but it seems to me that the distinction between having oil and gas production in your vicinity, if it is to be used for your nation's well-being, versus an export to another nation, that really gives a different feeling to that. So
I think that's right, and I think that gas is one of the, natural gas, at least as it stands now, the case for export, at least from the United States, the economic case for the export is not there because of the price on the international market for it. But it does have the potential of creating economic security so that we're not importing energy that natural gas could supplant. So, you know, I'm not an economist, but you know, what our economists have said is that export at this point is not, from a market's perspective, feasible, but that, you know, perhaps someday it could be. Although I will say that the technology with regards to natural gas is progressing so quickly that a lot of nations will be able to access reserves that they wouldn't be before, and so they wouldn't be customers. And so maybe that's a good thing. That instead of creating, again, a new system of winners and losers, if all nations could take advantage of relatively cleaner, cheaper energy, that, in my estimation, would be a good thing. I don't know if any of you read the article in the Atlantic this month on, I forget what they call it, methane gas. There it is, methane gas. Right
methane
there.
hydrate. It's the gentleman in the front has
Methane
that
hydrate.
article. Yes, wave that around there.
There you go.
Yes,
But fascinating article about shallow methane reserves offshore, and Japan is leading the way in figuring out how how to access it and use it in a way that would make a lot of the conversations that we're having change quite a bit. But again, this idea of natural gas becoming an export boom for the United States, I think is a little far-fetched, but giving us additional energy security, I think is probably accurate.
Okay, we're going into regulatory questions here. So, groundwater rules. What would you add to the adopted rules if you could? How did EDF hope the COGCC groundwater ruling would go? And what would you add if you could?
I've been told by so many people not to talk about the groundwater, but I can't help myself. Thank you for prompting the question. So we started the groundwater rulemaking pretty optimistic for a few reasons. The administration told us, just go out and find one company to come in here with you and we'll support you. And that's what the administration told us. So we went out and found a few operators who were willing to talk to us. We spent a day and then a few weeks afterwards kind of hammering out what we thought was a sensible proposal that was true to science. I hate to sound like a stereotypical environmentalist, but science is really important to EDF. Being true to science is one of our principles. Being a lawyer, I just don't understand that, but it doesn't matter. At any rate, we hammered out with a few operators a proposal that required a few things that I think are scientifically important to understand. One is that when you're monitoring groundwater, aquifers can shift and they don't always follow what you would think would be the path of underground aquifers. And so when you have activity that you want to monitor the impact of, it's important for you to have as many data points as you can in proximity to that activity. So every other regime that has been put in place to monitor groundwater, including what the EPA uses for underground injection wells, uses what's called a radial approach. Pick a radius. It's a little less important as to what that radius is, but test all the water sources that are in that radius, the radius from the new oil and gas well. What I learned in talking to our two groundwater scientists, neither of whom are big environmentalists, one was from Texas, one's from Oklahoma. I don't think they have environmentalists down there. But what they told us is that is a fundamental tenet of a scientifically valid groundwater monitoring process. The other thing that they hammered on is that you have to have a consistent sampling and analysis protocol in place. That one I could understand because, I took science when I was in high school. And if it's the old garbage in, garbage out principle. If you're using different methodologies or different processes to do your sampling and analyzing it in a lab, then you're going to get different results and you can't rely on being able to comparing apples to apples. And so those are the two big deficiencies that the OGCC kind of rejected out of hand. They did adopt a radial approach, but they said, but we're going to cap it at 4. So you don't have to sample more than 4 wells within a half mile of a new oil and gas well. And while we think, upgrading and downgrade, that's the other principle I left out. You need to take into account the gradient of the aquifer vis-a-vis the well. So you know what's coming in from uphill and what's going out from down well. And what these scientists told us, the guy from Texas, the guy from Oklahoma, is you need at least 1 upgrading and you need 2 downgrading in order to really have a valid universe to sample. But what the OGCC did was instead they said up to 4, and we'd like it if they were near the well, and it would be great if 1 was upgrading and 2 were down, but we're not going to require that. Just try to do that. And then let the operator decide which sources to sample. This gets really tedious and technical, but our scientists were pretty adamant that those 2 changes by themselves made the rule meaningless and really made it, giving people false confidence that they were going to have an adequate monitoring system in place. So we were pretty strident in our opposition to what they did. And then the last thing that they did is they carved out the Wattenberg area, which is the area that I talked about earlier where there's the most intense activity. And over half, in April alone, over half of the spills, again, it's spills that cause the contamination, not the fracking, but over the half of the spills in April that were reported at OGCC were in the Wattenberg area. they created a lesser standard. And it wasn't based on science or anything. It was based on the fact that there are a lot of oil and gas wells and there are a lot of water wells. To me, that calls for more intense scrutiny, not less. So for those reasons, we ended up opposing the rule. The governor is right when he says that Colorado is the first state in the country to require post-completion testing, which is true and which is nice. But that baseline testing, which is so critically important, they just got it wrong, and so we ended up not supporting the rule. I really felt like we were on a trajectory to get a deal done. We had Shell oil companies stay with us and make this proposal to the OGCC. Thought we had it in place, but the industry kind of closed ranks and didn't support it. They ended up not supporting the final rule either. But I think we were a little more upset than they were about it.
Well, you covered a lot there, and some of these questions will repeat things, and if you choose to say more on those, do that, and otherwise we'll move on here. But I think now we can release you from just talking about groundwater and go into a broader, please comment on the COGCC rulemaking in general, and why EDF didn't have more success. And maybe the groundwater one was the principal one. And then, boy, can you soar on this one, the highest priority for future legislation. What is your top priority or priorities? If you were emperor, that's, well, not quite that, but if you were writing back in your merry job at the legislature and leading that group.
Right. So, as I said, EDF has had kind of a mixed bag with the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. I alluded to this earlier, but a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, EDF worked with the commission, with the governor's office, and with several operators and the Trade Association for Industry to enact groundbreaking, best in the nation frac fluid disclosure rules, which I think was a victory. There are a lot of people who had some complaints about it, relying on Frac Focus, which is a website that regulators across the country rely on, that some people say is captured by industry. But we really put into place a strong frac fluid disclosure rule with a trade secrets exception that required certification that these are trade secrets, that we think made sense. It protected the intellectual property of industry. It required disclosure of not just the chemicals, but the concentrations of chemicals in fracking fluids, which we think was great, mainly because we saw it as kind of a building block to build trust and to move on to other areas where we could agree. I stood up in the governor's office with a representative from Halliburton and said this is a great rule, and it was a good result. As I said during the groundwater rules, I really think that the OGCC and the governor's staff and industry were trying to solve a different problem than we were trying to solve. We were trying to solve a scientific problem. They were trying to solve a political problem. And at the end of the day, neither of us solved any problem, in my view. So it's a mixed bag. I think the commission has a tradition of being captured by industry. There are a lot of industry representatives on the commission. Having said that, they've done a lot of good work over the last 5-7 years, including very protective rules for wildlife. So that I would say it's like any administrative agency, and we've had good times and we've had bad times. To the second question, what's our priority? So fortunately, the legislature is done for 2013. Everybody can come out of their houses now. Everybody's safe. There were a lot of bills. EDF, there was a groundwater bill that I went down and testified on, but EDF didn't have. There were a lot of other bills that were in play, reconstituting the Oil and Gas Commission, precluding conflicts of interest so that people who get paid by industry can't serve on the commission. There was a bill requiring, that you probably read about, requiring increasing the penalties and having a mandatory minimum for penalties for spills that affect human health and the environment, that died on the last day of the session. Lowering the spills reporting threshold. All of these were bills that EDF, we didn't have a position on, but that made the last few weeks of the session kind of interesting. But at the end of the day, nothing much passed. And I think it really did set the table for what I view as the next big thing, and that is the Air Quality Control Commission. So not the OGCC, but the Air Quality Control Commission, which, as its name probably cued you in on, deals with air quality issues, has initiated a stakeholder process, and that stakeholder process is going to result in a rulemaking starting late summer, early fall to address air emissions from oil and gas. And so all the issues that I talked about in my little discussion are going to be on the table for rulemaking. And so this is a huge opportunity to really make some progress in getting that leakage rate down, making the oil and gas life cycle leaner, meaner, and better for the environment. So we're very, very hopeful that this rulemaking will result in good progress in that front. The OGCC, it's a fairly, I wouldn't say it's obscure, but it's not a well-known administrative agency. It's comprised of 9 gubernatorial appointees, all of whom have incredible technical expertise, which is great because they know air issues. They're learning a lot about oil and gas issues now. They're taking field trips. They're getting presentations by groups like EDF and by industry on the whole process of oil and gas development, and gearing up for this rulemaking, which I think the stakes are pretty high.
Okay, why did North Dakota place that 1-year time frame on establishing a well?
I think initially it was tied to the 1-year lease. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But in a lot of ways it doesn't really matter because of how easily they grant the post 1-year exceptions. And I think I should say something that there's a lot of leadership by industry up there. A lot of the companies that are operating up there are making kind of voluntary commitments. You know, we're going to curb flaring so that we're only flaring 1% or 10% or whatever it is. And that's great to see because I think in North Dakota, like in a lot of other places, the regulatory bodies will follow industry. They won't lead it. The economic importance of the oil boom in North Dakota is such that regulators are loath to do anything that puts pressure on this industry. And so to say they're powerful is an understatement. I think it's really kind of they will do things that industry says is okay. I think there are some exceptions to that rule where the health department, for example, did an enforcement action on air emissions recently, which wasn't necessarily broadly supported by industry. But as far as doing something bold from a regulatory standpoint, it's probably not going to happen in North Dakota. Industry's really got to lead. Unfortunately, we're seeing companies like Continental, like Statoil, are starting to come around and say, you know, from a business perspective, this waste is intolerable. And so we're going to make a public commitment to our shareholders and to the people of North Dakota that we're going to curb it. And that kind of stuff needs to be championed and shouted more about by groups like EDF, frankly.
I think you covered some of this, but what policies are being considered to ensure zero tolerance for fugitive emissions? What is EDF pushing for? Fines, required monitoring?
Yeah, so as I alluded to in the comments earlier, I think that the way that we get there, that we get on the trajectory to zero tolerance for fugitive emissions is by requiring some of these modest steps like leak detection and repair, like additional controls on storage tanks, all the sexy things that I was talking about earlier can get us on that trajectory. As has been pointed out to a lot of my friends in industry, this equipment is built to leak. I mean, they have leak factors built into them. And so I don't want to mislead anybody that we can get to a point where there are no emissions from oil and gas extraction and production. But doing everything that we reasonably can to make sure that that is minimized, I think, is a reasonable goal. And so when the governor says zero tolerance for methane emissions, I think what he's saying is we need to say that it's a failure if we're not doing everything we can to stop the waste and to stop the leakage. So some of those common sense things are the ones I already alluded to, but a robust leak detection and repair, scaling back venting and flaring, addressing storage tanks. Those are the things that I think are the low-hanging fruit that can really get us on that trajectory.
And following up on a couple of phrases there, does green completion mean no flaring when a gas well is getting ready to go online?
No, it doesn't mean no flaring. It means capturing all of the gas, and a lot of it has to, at least initially, has to be flared unless they can capture it. As I understand, unless they can capture it. Green completion means either capturing or flaring, not letting it vent to the atmosphere.
And speaking of flaring, are there any studies on the combustion byproducts of flaring, especially after maintenance or hydraulic fracturing has occurred?
That's a great question, and I frankly do not know the answer to that.
Okay. Okay, so we're going towards...
One thing on that, though. There are different kinds of flares, and there are flares... the industry has... anyway, there are different kinds of flares, and some of them are more efficient than other kinds of flares. And what we're seeing is that they are becoming much more efficient. And so, but the difference is important, and they call it destructive rate efficiency, DRE, I think is what the acronym is. And destructive rate efficiency is really important, especially in a state like North Dakota where you have so much volume of flaring, that going from, say, a 90% requirement DRE to a 98% requirement DRE is huge based on what you're destroying in the reductions in CO2 emissions, which I think, and methane emissions coming from flares also. So if you have a flare that either you don't have continuous ignition and it blows out, and it's windy in North Dakota and it's windy in the plains of Colorado, then you're getting methane emissions. Or if you don't have a highly efficient flare, you're still getting methane emissions as well. So things can be done to make flares better, and a requirement of a high DRE for flares is important.
Okay, we're going to the governor for a bit here. Governor Hickenlooper was proud that Colorado gas production was going to test water before and after fracking. Is that a bill that failed, or was he saying that the regulators, that the Regulatory Commission was going to do it? Was he opposed to several of the bills because he claims the same results are better obtained through the commission? Do you agree? I'm sorry, I should have brought this one up when you're doing the bills before the legislature. So say something about that, Governor.
Okay. Yeah, so Governor Hickenlooper, obviously, he supported the rules that were adopted by the commission on groundwater monitoring, and he has said over and over again, Colorado is the first state in the nation that is requiring both pre- and post-completion monitoring of groundwater. That statement is entirely accurate. There's nothing inaccurate about it. It's just that the baseline requirements, as I said earlier, and got into painstaking detail around, is fundamentally flawed. His opposition, so the bill in the legislature that he's referring to was a bill, House Bill 1316. I actually had to go down to the legislature twice, to the Capitol twice. I don't like doing that. I only went there because the majority leader asked me to. At any rate, that bill, which died in the state Senate, would have done away with the carve-out for the greater Wattenberg area. That's all it would have done. So that the statewide rule, as I described it earlier, would have applied everywhere in the state without exempting the greater Wattenberg area. His opposition to that bill, as I remember it, and he had his staff out in force lobbying against it, was that the commission did a good job the first time, and if industry and the environmentalists were both angry, then they must have gotten it right.
Okay.
By the way, when I was in the legislature, I probably would have said the same thing. Just in all honesty.
Public attitudes and the governor's position. Do you have a sense of what the public's resistance to fracking, what impact that has had on our governor's attitude towards gas development and fracking?
Oh, that's a great question.
This is a good team.
It is.
I'd like to say.
It is.
And we get through all the questions in case you're...
My personal feeling, again, my perspective is somewhat removed. I don't live in a community that's directly impacted by oil and gas activity, so that's the first caveat that I have to make. But my feeling is that fracking has become a synonym for oil and gas activity in my backyard or next to my kid's school. And how could you not be moved by that if that was you, if that was your kids? So I think that is a dynamic that, frankly, the governor underestimated, and that is real. And he has made a lot of tactical mistakes in being dismissive of the complaints of the residents of Longmont and Erie, for example. I think on substance, on a lot of these things, he's probably right. From a legal perspective, local governments have somewhat limited ability to address the issues that folks care about and would like their local governments to address. I think making a tactical mistake in suing the city of Longmont, for example, over their regulations rather than letting industry do it was a tactical mistake that has just exacerbated the problem. I'm not sure what the way out for the governor is. I also think that he is a pro-business, moderate governor, which in virtually every other respect I'm entirely sympathetic to him for being. But I do think that he views this as one of the definitions of his being a pro-business, moderate Democrat. He also knows a lot about this issue, which as a politician is always dangerous. I'm speaking from experience. When you know a little bit about it and you're in that sphere, you know everything about it. And it's very hard for people to say that's not right, and for you to hear that in a way that kind of drives it in other contexts where you would be more responsive to it. I really think that he views natural gas, the shale gas boom, as a climate change solution. I think that's somewhat undermined by the fact that a lot of people have called into question his commitment to the issue of climate change because of things that he said during the campaign, such as, I'm not sure to what extent man-made activity is contributing to climate change, but we should do everything we can anyway. So I'm not sure about that, but I do think that he views this as an economic and environmental opportunity. And I do think that he's found himself in a little bit of a mess with regards to this local government issue. And the legislature wasn't able to address it in a satisfactory manner, so those issues are going to continue, and it's in litigation. And the folks in Boulder County and Longmont and Erie and Fort Collins, but not only there, other communities like Colorado Springs, this is going to continue to be a problem for the governor. Is it a problem that's going to threaten his reelection? Probably not. But it could certainly make things more interesting come next November.
We won't have Don Mays, we won't have Congressman McInnes's.
Well, and if you think about that, to get into the partisan politics for a minute, if there's no real perceived threat to this very popular governor who, despite this issue, still is polling in the high 60% or the high 50s, no, mid 60% approval rating, with no real Republican opponent out there willing to take him on, and I don't see a primary threat for the governor. I don't think there's a lot of impetus on the side for him to change his perspective with regards to this. And again, I think it comes from something that he knows and understands, and so it's anyway. And of course, I'm totally dismissing the possibility that he's right.
This has a reference to Governor Hickenlooper, but also stays on public attitudes. Are we experiencing a situation with the continued leaking of hydrocarbons into Parachute Creek and the Colorado River that can be compared to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico? Why isn't there more open discussion about this? Shame on our legislature, Hickenlooper, for not increasing fines for oil and gas companies' quote mistakes and unquote spills and leaks. I should have stood up and made more gestures.
I'm very sympathetic to the sentiment. There was an effort in the legislature to increase fines for spills that have significant impacts on public health and environment. That legislation failed on the last day in a kind of political kerfuffle over whether or not there should be a mandatory minimum daily fine for these types of violations. The sponsor of the bill had introduced a bill that I think had it at for these are the egregious types of violations, not just spills, but spills that actually impact public health and environment. The legislation that was introduced in the House of Representatives had a $5,000 mandatory minimum fine. There is no mandatory minimum fine now under current law. And then it also raised the amount of fines that could be, the discretionary side of the fines that could be inflicted on industry for spills. Parachute Creek was happening during the session, so you would think that that might put some more political impetus behind it. The governor supported the bill with the exception of that mandatory minimum fine. So the sponsor of the bill went back to the governor's office and said, okay, we have to have something in there. There can't be no mandatory minimum. There has to be some mandatory minimum. Why don't we reduce it to $2,500? So reduce it in half. The governor's office and industry said, no, we want it out of there. That's the compromise. Let's increase the fines, but let's not have a mandatory minimum. And that's where the impasse was. He got 3 Democratic senators to support his position when the bill was over there. So the mandatory minimum piece got stripped out in the Senate, and the House decided to adhere to its position, and the bill died. So the same day, that was the last day of the session, the governor did issue an executive order directing the COGCC to evaluate its fine structure and come back with recommendations to change it. COGCC does not have authority to implement a new fee structure without legislation, so that will maybe happen next time. But what's interesting is that you don't see a lot of outrage about these types of spills as opposed to spills that happen elsewhere. And not that it's at the same magnitude as a Deepwater Horizon, but you still are seeing contamination that you would think would generate more outrage than it actually does. And that's something that we should all think about.
We're hitting a little unit here, which is the sort of hold up the mirror to this community section here. Should we only focus this discussion on the production of oil and gas, but instead should we focus on the demand? If we banned gasoline sales in Boulder and banned all natural gas heating, would we not achieve the same goal?
It's so nice to be reminded where I am. Yes, but EDF would not support that.
Okay, and staying on our locality, Boulder has voted to municipalize its energy with wind and solar, but the proponents have been very clear that natural gas is a key part of this when the sun does not shine and the wind does not blow. Is it not hypocrisy to advocate for gas for municipalization, but to ban it in Boulder, or ban its production in Boulder?
That's really interesting.
People really enjoy this. The speakers have so enjoyed these. This whole.
Well, without opining on the merits of municipalization of Boulder's electric utility, Mark Udall and I served together in the State House of Representatives for 2 years, and he had a phrase that he liked to use, which has stuck with me over the years, and that was consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. So be that a distraction for a moment, but I think that Boulder, both with its oil and gas regulations and its municipalization, is really kind of being innovative in the way that it provides power to its citizens, and I think that that's a beautiful thing for Boulder. There's always risk with endeavors like that. Risks in reliability, risks involved in driving industry out, if you will, of Boulder County. But to me, it's just people trust government that's closest to them, right? If you think about it, I trust my city council person more than I trust my state representative, more than I trust my governor, more than I trust even my congressman. And I think that's a natural thing for people to feel. And so when Longmont or Boulder or Fort Collins have their locally elected officials engage in this issue, not municipalization, but oil and gas regulation, I think it's appropriate that people get outraged when people say, no, they can't do that. I understand the legal issues involved, given that there is broad authority in the Oil and Gas Commission to regulate oil and gas activity in the state. But I also understand that this is a local control state and that we trust our local officials to make these decisions for us. And so it just seems to me that we should be able to figure out that local land use issues should be decided by local officials, that resource issues, it's probably appropriate that the Oil and Gas Commission remain preeminent on that. And then obviously the details is what kills you. What's a resource issue? What's a land use issue? And unfortunately right now we're on a trajectory where the courts are going to tell us the answer to that question as opposed to having a real conversation about it. When I was in the legislature, local control was something that everybody talked about and valued. Despite what some of my, Ken Gordon, another colleague of mine that I served with, said to me once, I'm all for local control except when I'm not. And I would say that there are people out there that just want the right answer, and they feel like they're getting the right answer from their local government, or they feel like they're getting the right answer from the administration. I just think local control as a value, as a deeply Western value, is important. And so we need to find a better solution than suing over these issues and letting the courts decide for us. But unfortunately, that conversation didn't even start at the legislature this time. Maybe next year.
Did you want to go back to the word hypocrisy and
Sure.
reflect on that word, or no? Okay, well I think the question writer wanted
Yes.
to accent that.
So the hypocrisy involved, all of us in our daily lives suffer a lot of hypocrisy, at least I do. We are all consumers of energy, whether we like it or not. The lights have to go on. We have to get to work. I have to pick my kids up at school. We all use energy, and the crowd that says that we need to ban gasoline or that we need to, we need to live a life where we only rely on the sun and the wind, in my view, that's hypocritical. But I'm hypocritical too, because I'm very passionate about these issues, but I drive my car to work every day. I take airplanes to visit family. We all have to we all have to wake up in the morning and look at ourselves in the mirror, and finding that balance, I think, is tough. But we all have to suffer a little bit of hypocrisy, I think.
Is there more to be done to reduce waste of energy and to increase the use of smart energy technology?
Well, it's everybody says that the least expensive investments in clean energy is conservation, and I think that rings true. Efficiency. The one thing we know about our economy is that technology always drives efficiency, and the market always drives efficiency. Sometimes it's not as fast as we'd like, and sometimes there are tweaks that we can make in the regulatory arena to push technology along the lines of innovating towards efficiency. But I think that needs to be the goal, and I hope that what I talked about today with regards to methane leakage and natural gas falls into that same category, and we'll end up in that same category where the market forces are predisposed to go down this road anyway, and all they need are a few regulatory nudges to push them there to realize that efficiency.
Well, speaking of that, now we're, by the way, I am moving along here. We do have this thing about covering all the questions. And we used to have things where there would be 10 cards about the Halliburton exemption, and we haven't got a single one. What happened to you all here? We used to just really want to talk about the Halliburton exemption, but not you. We're not talking about that. I think the range of your comments have brought us, but we are moving in towards the last ones here. So I want to shift to the role of industry. We've touched on that a little bit in some of your remarks here. How representative are studies funded, and how telling are studies funded by the oil and gas operators and measurements done with site access and pre-planning? So how representative and telling are the studies that the industry cooperates with or participates in?
I guess I don't really have an opinion on that. I think that it goes back to the initial issue of kind of credibility and trust, and building that trust so that people feel confident. And that's going back to groundwater for a moment. I think that's where industry and EDF were actually aligned in our objectives, which is to create more confidence that a resource like groundwater is being protected in this industrial activity. I think we fell short, but that's neither here nor there. I think that it's right for anybody to question studies that are commissioned by anybody if they're not peer-reviewed, if they're not subject to scrutiny beyond just the entity that's proposing them. And I think that goes just as much to EDF or to CSU than it does industry. And so I think it's completely valid to question methodology or question sample size. And this huge study that I referred to earlier that EDF and industry is collaborating on is going through a rigorous peer review process. And I think that that's appropriate.
because I don't think people should just take our word for it because we're EDF. Actually, it would probably be the opposite, but I just think science is so critical to these questions that it is certainly understandable when people question any study. I don't think that a study, just because it's funded by industry, is flawed. I think it deserves just as much scrutiny as a study that comes from EDF, and it's the science that should control.
Please give an example where the oil and gas industry did something to mitigate pollution without being forced to do it through legislation, EPA, etc. And, well, then your answer seems to be foreclosed by the next sentence. So you answer, and then I'll give you the next sentence.
Well, since we've talked so much about groundwater, even though I'm not supposed to talk about groundwater anymore, the Oil and Gas Association, the Trade Association for Oil and Gas Companies in the state, had a voluntary groundwater monitoring regime in place well before the state decided to take it up in rulemaking. So this voluntary program that KOGA had put in place was why we were so optimistic that we would get a good rule out of the process, but is also a good example of industry getting out in front of an issue. Now, you need to understand also that there's a component of groundwater monitoring that's protecting industry, right? If you're identifying baseline constituents of groundwater, you've got a defense when somebody tries to sue you for water pollution. So it makes sense that they do that. Nonetheless, there was no regulation in place saying, industry, go do this. And as we were going through the process, one of the things that we learned is that even though it was voluntary, something like 90% of the wells that were being drilled in the state were being done pursuant to this voluntary program. Now, it wasn't as robust or scientifically perfect as EDF would have wanted, but that's one example. Another I referred to earlier in North Dakota, you have two companies who are getting out in front and saying we're going to curb our flaring when they're not required by law to do so in ways that are significant. There are lots of examples of industry getting out in front of issues, but it doesn't mean that we don't need strong regulation, because we do.
Okay, I think the next question assumed that you would say, well, actually, no, there aren't any examples. So, but we do get, actually, this is a perfect next question. Is doing it right a regulatory issue, or is it a non-regulatory voluntary issue? Where does certification fit into the solution? It's monitoring being done in Colorado. Kirby Wing said that they could not do it in a systematic way. So, but really that big framework question is the one I think Jack said, is doing it right a regulatory issue, or is it a non-regulatory voluntary issue, or some mixture or combination of those?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's got to be a regulatory issue, but I think there is a role for leadership. And as I said just a minute ago, we've seen that leadership on other issues. And so getting it right means having companies come to the table and say, there's no law or regulation requiring us to do this, but we're going to do it because it's the right thing to do. And the example of North Dakota applies again, where you're talking about, in addition to being environmentally harmful, you're talking about huge waste. They could heat all the homes in North Dakota every year for the amount of gas that they flare. So that's a kind of consumer pressure on that issue that's also pressing companies to show leadership. But at the end of the day, we are a society that's governed by laws, and I think laws should reflect the best practices that are out there, and that even if you're getting strong leadership in industry, that strong leadership should be recognized in a regulatory regime that encompasses what's working, as opposed to being a substitute for the rule of law.
Okay. Now I have three that I should probably have integrated in before, but we'll go through those, and then we'll have these last two, and then we're going out on some public trust issues. How can the market possibly work for electricity when there is a monopoly that profits from investments in fossil fuels?
I have no idea.
Okay. I'm not sure what a monopoly, an oligopoly, maybe an oligopoly. We learned that in graduate school, oligopoly. Well, anyway.
Well,
okay.
I can speak. I mean, there's one issue here that I think I might be able to speak on, and that is that in part of the deals that have resulted in environmental progress down at the legislature in recent years, part of the give and take has been giving the state's largest utility the opportunity to own the investor created new energy producers. And that's a legitimate question, because that certainly impacts the rates that consumers pay, and it impacts the profits for for the utility. So I think that's a legitimate question as far as being a monopoly that's invested in fossil fuels. I'm not sure about that, but I do think that's a legitimate question. I think the market can work just fine if, huge if it accounts for environmental degradation. And we see that in every environmental issue that I've worked on since I've been at EDF. The Colorado River I worked on for 2 years. There's no cost to drying up a stream to extinction. A couple of fish, right? So the markets don't work for that. So internalizing that somehow is the way that you address that problem. Cap and trade is the other issue. How do you totally get away from fossil fuels? Well, unless somebody can wave a magic wand and make renewables competitive tomorrow, you have to reform the market so that it accounts for the environmental degradation of combustion of fossil fuels. So anyway, I got a little off track.
Well, this is one I should have had back in the monitoring thing. If methane leakage statewide is this topic, why can't it be measured and or monitored from space by a scientific satellite?
I think technology is improving. It's not necessarily from space that I'm aware of, although remote sensing is a promising technology that, again, in the water world is becoming more ubiquitous. But definitely infrared cameras, for example, where you can survey an entire area of pipes and gathering lines and tanks and quickly figure out where it's leaking. In some cases, measure the intensity of the leak. The other part is that you can actually, there are even lower cost methane sensors that can be used that just indicate when there's a spike in methane leakage that then can be addressed through other means, such as using sniffers or this really new technology of soap and water where you put soapy water on a pipe and it bubbles. That's actually a very effective way to indicate where there are leaks. So, but as far as those are all ways to kind of locally figure out, in some cases, how much is leaking. But as far as the global average is a number that so far has been elusive. What I think the EDF, University of Texas, and industry study will shed light on is where we can make the most progress. What reforms can we put in place, like leak detection and repair, for example, that can get us down as close as we can to zero, rather than figuring out exactly what that number is. But I think we have pretty good confidence that it's closer to 1 than it is to 9.
Is it the case that the 1974 Energy Reorganization Act, both one, artificially keeps fossil fuel and nuclear costs low? It sounded like the president from over there, nuclear, I was trying to say, but it didn't come out right. So, okay. You made the first Texas joke, and now I'm making the second one here. Okay, excuse me. Is it the case that the 1974 Energy Reorganization Act, both one, artificially keeps fossil fuel and nuclear costs low, and 2, conflicts with the implementation of a tax on carbon?
I think that there is some truth to the statement that that the Energy Act had tax incentives for the petroleum industry that have had the effect of subsidizing pieces of it. But I don't think to the extent where it's distorted the market such that without them, renewables would be competitive. That I think is a different question that would require real market reforms. Conflicts with the implementation of a tax on carbon. I don't know. I do think that the current administration is taking a hard look, and the Congress is taking that should give everybody confidence, right? Is taking a hard look at all tax subsidies, and hopefully these will be part of it. But then you have to remember too that tax incentives for renewable energy is going to be on the chopping block too, as the Congress looks to scale back and simplify the tax code.
Please comment on EDF's position on a carbon tax, which the questioner thinks could be done with cap and trade, that these would not be mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and I think that that debate that happened a while ago, this is one of those life lessons, right? I don't think everybody at EDF saw it that way, but it's one of those life lessons where we were as an organization so dismissive of the idea of a carbon tax, because in our political calculation, a carbon tax was just politically ridiculous. There was no way you could get anything. If there was any hope for cap and trade, it was tiny, and a carbon tax just never would have flown. But I think in our post-Waxman-Markey post-mortem, one of the things that we came to realize is that we were pretty narrow-minded about that a price on carbon, regardless of whether it is in the form of a cap and trade or a carbon tax or some combination of a carbon tax and cap and trade, should have been on the table to expand the constituency for putting a price on carbon. We thought it was unworkable from a political perspective, not necessarily from an implementation perspective. There was some talk, actually a lot of talk, that when we were running up against the last fiscal crisis, that the Congress was going to enact a carbon tax as part of a grand bargain. I don't need to tell you that that didn't quite happen, but it was being talked about in a much broader sense than just liberal environmentalists. Conservatives were talking about it too as part of a grand bargain and simplification of the tax code. So I do think that once the political climate changes, and we can start talking about national climate policy again, I think you're going to see more prominence of either a hybrid or a carbon tax as being part of that, as opposed to being wedded to a particular solution that we saw with cap and trade. I mean, it's easy for us to say in hindsight, but we put a lot of investment and political capital on the idea that businesses were going to help us get this thing done. And businesses were in favor of cap and trade because that was a model that they understand. Tell us what the goal is, let us reach it. Let us innovate. Let us profit from the investments and the innovations that we make. Just as a matter of principle, that's EDF's tune too. But at the end of the day, that wasn't enough to get the deal done. If you're asking my personal opinion, I don't think there's any way a carbon tax would have done it either. But I think we were probably a little too dismissive of these other ideas. I think at the end of the day, nothing was going to, and cap and trade became, as everybody knows, it became anathema. It became the subject of conservative talk radio. Cap and trade as if it were some disease, as opposed to a market-based solution, which, we had, I think at the end of the day, US CAP, which was the organization that EDF helped put together, we had something like, 47 Fortune 500 companies supporting cap and trade. But the way you'd hear it talked about on talk radio, it was socialism. Okay.
I have these two questions that are sort of bookend in time. When was natural gas discovered as a useful resource and where?
I have no idea.
Well,
somebody here must know.
I'm a historian, but we'll come back to that, I guess.
The question was when and where was natural gas discovered?
But then it is bookended in the most wonderful way with this question. Is there any stopping fracking?
No. No. I mean, no. First of all, it's been with us almost as long as industrialized oil and gas activity. If you're talking about fracking, the process of fracturing formations to get oil and gas out, it's something that's been around for a long time. And even if you were to stop it, the directional drilling aspect of oil and gas activity is also a force that is opening up all these new formations for development. So no, I don't think there's any stopping fracking. I think we will see a proliferation of fracking across the globe. China's reserves are expanding, I don't know if it's geometrically or exponentially, but some large amount, because they haven't started fracking yet, but they have frackable reserves that are probably going to dwarf the United States. So it's a market force to be reckoned with, and no, I don't think there's anything that would stop.
Following very closely from that, what are the best practices in natural gas? I don't think you can do well, but especially how would those provide lessons for the rest of the world?
It's actually a great question. It's something that I didn't refer to in the PowerPoint, but in the Marcellus in the east, EDF is, and we're getting a lot of criticism from other environmental groups for this, but we've started an effort called the Center for Sustainable Shale Development. And what the CSSD is again, it's a cooperative enterprise. There are a couple other environmental groups with us and operators in the Marcellus Shale to talk about this very issue. What are the right ways to do oil and gas development? And it has to do with doing baseline groundwater testing and following up with monitoring. It has to do with making sure that every well you do is done in a green completion. It means that you're flaring if you have to do it, or that you're capturing as much as you can, but if you're flaring, that you're doing it with the highest efficiency DREs that you can. And what will come of this is what we're hoping is that it would inform the policy decisions of regulators in the region, such that these best practices actually become the floor rather than the ceiling. So it's certainly not without its controversy, but it's a promising effort to work with industry to figure out the best way to do this and the least environmentally degrading way to do it. Make no mistakes, it's an industrial process. It's going to be dirty. There are going to be leaks. We've already talked about all that, but there are good ways to do it and not so good ways to do it.
You seem like co-authors for a sequence here. So on the topic of public trust, what 3 things would you write into an industry's social license to operate?
So let me take my EDF hat here for a moment and just say, being a good neighbor, I think would be first and foremost the most important thing to be a part of that contract. And that can encompass everything from the cumulative impacts of noise and traffic and lights and that kind of thing to minimizing emissions and using the best available control technologies for every aspect of what they do. So that's just my personal thing, is being a good neighbor. I think air emissions from EDF's perspective is the most important, and I think groundwater protection is probably the second most important. And when you address the groundwater and you address the emissions, you're really addressing all of the kind of close in proximity health impacts of the activity. And I think you're getting at most of the problems that can get there. But I do think that that industry's best practices are evolving and getting better, and that's something that we should continue to encourage. But again, I don't think that it is a substitute for strong regulations. That social contract is fine, but it shouldn't be a substitute for strong regs.
What should be done to find truth? This is our concluding question. What should be done to find truth and build trust in the debate about hydraulic fracturing?
It's funny, I got this exact same question a week or two ago when I was on a panel with former Governor Ritter, Tisha Schuler from Koga, and a representative from Anadarko. And all 4 of us kind of had the same answer, and that is continuing conversations like this and like the series that Patty, that the center has put on to try to reach as many people. And again, this idea of turning down the volume and talking about substance in a way that's not so polarizing, I guess is the way to put it. Understanding, and it's hard for all of us, but understanding that we're not always right, that our view of the world isn't the only view of the world, that there are competing environmental and economic interests that need to be weighed. Only when we kind of understand those truths can we then build the kind of trust that we need to make progress on this. I work for an environmental organization. I have an environmental ethic that's very strong. My family shares that. But I have to understand that there are thousands, tens of thousands of people in this state that rely on the oil and gas industry for their livelihood. I have to understand that as a state we're dependent on this industry for our economic well-being. I have to understand that people have property rights that need to be respected, and that's part of the social contract also. On the other hand, industry has to understand that the bottom line isn't the only line, that they need to be good corporate citizens, that they need to be good neighbors, and that they need to be able to, come to a table, make a good compromise, and stick with their word. So I think we all just need to develop a little bit broader perspective on these things, figure out where there's enough common ground that we can move forward. Industry needs to understand that the fractivists aren't going away. Fractivists have to understand that oil and gas isn't going away, and that we need to figure out how we can coexist in a way that is not so destructive of our planet. And again, the one caveat is that I don't live near one of these wells, and I sympathize with people who do. It's got to be hard. I don't know what I think my perspective would probably be a lot different if I did.
Thank you.